Victoria, if you want.
Test. All right.
Alright, so everybody start settling in. Are you having fun yet? So I wanted to start out just thanking everybody for coming to what has been a really moving and incredible conference for me. It has been so wonderful meeting people from across the country who feel as passionately about this issue as I do. You know, sometimes in San Francisco especially, I feel like I'm this crazy person hanging out with them out there. And it's nice to know that there's a big, broad community of people who believe in cities and who want them to function for everyone, and who believe that it is going to take a lot of political work to get us there, who are going to engage in that political process with us. And on that note, I want to introduce one of my favorite people in local politics, Senator Scott Wiener. So one of the first things I did when I was kind of getting excited about this issue is I wrote an article, like an op-ed in our local newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. And I was like, well, that's silly, like no one's gonna care, but I did it, yay. And I get this like, oh my God, it turns out Scott Wiener said, find me that woman. And immediately scheduled a coffee date and was like, I want to talk to you, figure out what you're about, because it seems like you really care about this issue. And he has done everything he can to empower this movement from day one. He was one of the first people who recognized the power that we were going to have to change the system, and who wanted to be the vanguard of this movement. And so I just want to say thank you so much, Scott Wiener, for everything you've done. So the first question, what's it like to have so many fans?
Well, in politics you have fans and sometimes you have detractors too. So, although they're here protesting you, not me. Usually I'm the one they're protesting. You know, I have to say I really love what the YIMBY movement is doing, not just because it's empowering people, and especially young people, to get involved who maybe haven't been involved before, but in a very sort of selfish way, it allows me more space to do the work that I do, because you are a partner, you create political momentum that didn't exist before. When I first took office in 2011 on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, it was pretty lonely being pro-housing in City Hall. You would have hearings on projects or on legislation, and it would just, all these people opposing and just being anti-housing and anti-development would be there. And the only people who were really advocating for more housing were people in the planning department and the developers. And of course people, the developers have a financial interest, so people don't listen to that very much. And then over time, as the YIMBY movement grew, we would have a counterbalance. We would have people showing up and talking about, what about my housing? What about my future? What about, I want to have a family. I want to be able to stay here in the Bay Area and have a life. And that is just a very, very, very powerful thing, and it has completely shifted and balanced out the dynamic. We still have opposition, and that's fine. It is a free country, and people have a right to whatever view they want, but we now have a much greater diversity of viewpoints represented, so thank you.
Give yourself a So a lot has been happening since we, and I take credit for this, since we moved you up to Sacramento. I think there's a big appetite in a way that we had never seen before for doing real statewide change on these issues, on saying that the problem is statewide and therefore the solution is going to be statewide. And I think you as a junior senator, is how people refer to you disparagingly often.
A freshman.
Yes. Have taken an incredible leadership role, validating my choices. And I'm wondering, this sort of you taking, did you think that new blood was necessary? It seems to me like someone brave and new blood was needed to really take the lead on this California-wide issues. But what has been your experience since moving up to Sacramento?
Sure, and thank you. A lot of people in this room really did help get me to the Senate. When you have for anyone who didn't follow the race, it was a sort of a crazy race, and I won by 8,000 votes out of almost 500,000 cast. So it was a very close race, and so I'm really appreciative of all the support. And housing was definitely a big issue in the race. There were some real stark differences between me and my opponent. So thank you. And getting up to Sacramento, there are many ways. Many reasons why being in the legislature is so much better than being in Congress, and God bless everyone in Congress who's fighting the good fight for us right now. There are reasons that you know, but one of the reasons that you may not know is when you go to Congress, it takes like forever to be able to get the seniority necessary to do anything. It can take 10, 15, 20 years. The great thing about the California legislature is you can hit the ground running on day one. You don't want to be arrogant about it. I still have a lot to learn, and I am very respectful of the people who have been doing this longer. But you really have the space, if you choose to take it up, to be aggressive. And so on housing, I decided early on I wanted to be very aggressive on state housing policy, because really in the end, the state is the only entity that has the power to hold local communities accountable for doing what they need to do. And I don't like to demonize local government, because people in local government overwhelmingly are people who just care about their communities and they're trying to do the right thing, but they don't have the space to do it because there's so much opposition, and it's really hard to be a local elected office when you're trying to make positive change around housing. And so the state can provide some of that support and some of that coverage. I've had the number of city council members from around the state who have approached me over the last 6 months and said, you know what, I can't say this publicly, but thank you for doing a streamlining bill, because it's so hard for us to push back when we get all of this resistance to development. But so I'm like, this will just be a nice gesture. We'll work on it for the next 10 years and hopefully be able to get something done. And what I realized pretty quickly, and I was pleasantly surprised, was that the amount of pro-housing, you'll see that it's gotten to a breaking point. And so we have bipartisan support. I have some very conservative Republicans and some very, very lefty Democrats who are supporting it. I also just want to give a lot of credit to the leadership of both houses. The president of the Senate, Senator Kevin De Leon, who represents part of Los Angeles, from the minute I went to see him when we started this and talked to him about it, he didn't even blink. He immediately said, "This is a great idea." He said, enough with the obstructionism. He just got it immediately and has been just a staunch supporter from the very beginning. And the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, has also just been a staunch supporter. And so without the support of the legislative leadership, it would have been really hard to move the bill. So it's been good to be able to get a quick start.
Really awesome to hear that there's a lot of hope. I think that some of us who've been in the trenches feel, often pretty embattled in this issue, and you were out there putting your neck out, earlier than many of us. One thing that I want to ask, I think, is what keeps you motivated? What keeps you saying, I want to keep banging my head up against this wall? Obviously, success is always fun. But I'm wondering, when you have the days when things, when you feel like, the law, legislation that you're trying to put forward is hitting up against some walls, what are things that keep you going?
Sure. I mean, for me, it's pretty personal. So I've lived in San Francisco in the district for 20 years. And a 7-year-old gay man coming to San Francisco into the Castro for the same reasons that generations before me had done, both gay and straight, people coming to the city to make a life for themselves. And what I've seen over the years is that it's become progressively harder for people to do that. For me, I was lucky. I got a rent-controlled apartment, and then 7 years later, in 2004, I was able to buy a very small 500 square foot condo in the Castro, and so I feel like I'm lucky. I will never live in a unit in the Castro bigger than the unit I'm in. I'm going to be in this unit until I die, probably, because I can't afford anything else. I could not afford to come into my own neighborhood today, and I'm not poor. And so when I see around me in my own community the number of, for example, LGBT seniors who are being pushed out, people come up to me on the street and say, my landlord is painting my building, and I'm terrified that means I'm going to be evicted. That we've gotten to the point where tenants are scared when they see their landlord doing something that should make you happy, painting the building. The number of people I know in my community who they have a kid, and maybe they have the second kid, and they can't make do in a one-bedroom apartment anymore, and there's nowhere for them to go that they can possibly afford, and so they leave. Sometimes they come over to the East Bay, putting gentrification pressures in Oakland, and hence some of the protests that we see. Sometimes they leave the state entirely. And so for me, it just breaks my heart when people who are so committed to San Francisco, to the Bay Area, to California, just can't make a go of it because of bad housing policy for the last 50 years. And so I'm committed to changing that.
I think so. California, we clap. California, I think we've had the benefit of things being the worst here in a strange way. It gives us the leadership opportunity, I guess, to turn it around. And I'm wondering what advice, we've got people from as far away as London here, and I'm wondering what advice do you have, especially maybe for other people, they're elected officials who are looking to take a leadership, and what have you learned that you think would be helpful for people?
Sure. Well, I think for leaders, people who are in elected office or who may aspire to be in elected office, you have to be prepared to just be abused. And it's not just around housing, around any kind of, like, when you're talking about fundamental change, you know, you're going to rile people up. And so you know, for my 6 years in the Board of Supervisors and now in the Senate, but particularly when I was in the local office, and I was, you know, they were in the Mission District in San Francisco, with a terrible problem with displacement in that neighborhood, particularly of our Latino community. And frankly, it's been going on for, you know, about 50 years. I read articles in the 70s about mass protests in the Mission because Latino families were being displaced, but it's accelerated over time. And it's a real problem, and it's bad, and, you know, we all want it to stop and do what we can to help. But there were some people who, in my view, had a misguided idea that the solution was to put a moratorium on housing in the Mission. They went to the Board of Supervisors and they went to the ballot. Unfortunately, we were able to defeat that measure. And I was one of the most vocal opponents of it, and I felt like, even though it would have been easier to keep my head down and just not support it and not say anything, I felt like it was really important to have vocal political leadership to say this is not the right approach, it's just going to make it even worse. You know, I got protests in my house. I got, you know, this and, you know, like this on a number of occasions. That's why I was happy it wasn't protests to me today. Get PTSD eventually. And you just have to have super thick skin, because the people who are protesting are raising, you know, these folks outside, they're raising real issues, right? These are real issues about people being pushed out, and it's on us to try to really get the message out that the solution is to have more housing. And so it's also, I think, you know, just being so tightly organized and having sort of the shock troops who can, you know, Laura and Sonia and Brian, everyone who, like, you know, can on a moment's notice get people out to a public hearing or bus people up to Sacramento to testify. That kind of tight organization really matters, and building out an organization where year after year after year you continue is really hard. It requires enormous energy. It requires succession planning, because we all have shelf lives, and then, you know, we move on to other things. And so just keeping that momentum and having a strong organization really matters a lot.
So are you hiring?
Not at the moment, but I did. I hired one of my legislative aides. I thought maybe she would be here today, but she deserves a break. Annie Fryman, who I hired. She was one of the original YIMBYs, and I hired her as a legislative aide, and she does all of my housing and transportation work, including SB 35, which is like a labor of love for her. She's just done tremendous work, but we'll be hiring at some point.
So a lot of the ways in which we as the YIMBYs engage with this is in campaigns. And campaign work is some of the most brutal work that I think elected officials do and that activists do. And I'm wondering, you know, when you're picking kind of, I think that you got pegged as like the smart nerd. I remember the You Have to Be a Square video. Was anybody else? Was really good. You know, you have fully leaned into your identity as a policy wonk. And I don't see that very common at all. And I'm wondering, you know, is that more of a personal choice that you've made? Is that, you know, how do you recommend, I think, we're trying to go towards science-oriented legislation in the future, and that's a national trend. I'm wondering sort of how you see yourself as part of, I see you as part of that movement, and I want you to validate that I see that.
You know, and I was really bad at science, by the way, so, but I trust other people. My view of elected office and succeeding in elected public life is just being who you are and not trying to be something else. And if you think about who are the people that you like the most, whether in politics or in entertainment or in sports, I bet you if you put a list together, it's a lot of people who it feels like they're authentic. You know, some of the, you know, I love Katy Perry, I will admit. And one of the reasons I love her is I feel like she's just who she is, and she doesn't, you know, and I find that in sports too. Like there are people who they just are who they are, and they don't try to like just sort of create a persona. You just feel, you can sort of feel like they're just who they are. And I've tried to be that way in politics. I know that I'm not the life of the party. I'm not the most fascinating, always, in person in the room. I'm sort of a little introverted by nature. So I'm not gonna be one of those politicians who's gonna just bowl everyone over because I'm like just the sheer magnetism. And so for me, it's always been just being who I am, and that is a little bit nerdy. But I've also been, tried to be open about, my own life as a gay man. I a few years ago announced, 3 years ago now, that I take a medication called PrEP, which is a once daily pill that almost eliminates the risk of HIV. And at the time, people were telling me, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, you're revealing too much, but I did it because there was a lot of stigma around HIV prevention, and so I thought it would be important to try to raise the conversation, and it worked pretty well. And so I've tried to always, in all aspects, just sort of be who I am, be very transparent, and I think voters like that. I think they like sort of feeling like they know who you are and what you're about.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit back to housing, because that's what we love. I often run into this conversation, I know you do too, of housing is a fundamental, and it touches every part of our lives and every part of government. That you think you're having a conversation about housing, and then you're having a conversation about transit, and then you're having a conversation about schools, and then you're having a conversation about access to services, and it is so fundamental to our lives that it is very easy to be sidelined into saying we can't solve X until we solve Y. And I have seen you really hit that head on and say, we're going to solve X and we're going to solve Y. And I'm wondering, in those conversations, how do you keep things on track in a sort of solution-based policy?
I think in talking about housing, it is really important to show the linkages to other things, because, as you say, housing is foundational to everything. So we're all trying to get more resources into public education to try to make sure that we're doing right by the next generation in stopping the chronic underfunding of public education in California. But you can have the best schools in the world, and if a kid is living with his family, couch surfing, or living in a car, or in a homeless shelter, or overcrowded with 10 people in a one-bedroom apartment, that kid, I can guarantee you, is not going to reach his or her full education potential. They're going to come to school tired and maybe hungry, and so there's that linkage. We try to, one thing that I've tried to say over and over again is that you cannot say that you are an environmentalist unless you are pro-housing, and even apart from. Even apart from the extreme examples like the local San Francisco chapter of the Sierra Club that persistently opposes infill density, even putting that aside, there are many environmentalists who aren't necessarily opposed to housing, but they're not fighting for housing. And environmentalists must be fighting for housing, because we know that if we're just pushing people into long commutes and into sprawl, that is terrible for the environment. 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in California come from the transportation sector, and we have to get that down. And the way you get it down, in significant part, is letting people take trams to work, walk to work, bike to work, or if they're driving, have a much shorter drive. We talk about economic development, and I have been really, for SB 35, been working hard to build business community support for the bill, and we've had some success because the lack of housing is a huge threat to our economy. If employers don't think their workers are going to be able to find housing somewhat close to work, they're not going to come here, or they're not going to grow here. We're already seeing evidence of California companies who are choosing to grow elsewhere precisely because of housing. And so it links to so many different challenges that we face, and we have to keep getting that message out. It's not just about housing, it's about housing as a foundation for everything else.
So on that note, housing touches everything. Who do you see as the sort of core coalition? We've talked a lot about coalition building at the conference and building allies. What do you think are maybe under-tapped resources for us?
I think there's a lot of potential. So we have the affordable housing nonprofit developers, the people who are building housing for low-income people in particular. I think historically they've sometimes just done their own thing, advocated for their own, but I think they've realized more and more that the obstruction of housing, that they're just completely tied. They know that they're tied in to that, and I want to recognize Sam Moss from Mission Housing, who's here and who's been just a tremendous supporter of pro-housing policies and has taken a lot of heat for it, so thank you, Sam. So really working with the affordable housing nonprofit development world is important, and I think is a very powerful coalition. They're a powerful voice for what we're trying to do, but it's broader than that. Some of our strongest supporters of SB 35, in addition to the affordable housing developers, are the California Apartment Association, the California Association of Realtors. I have disagreements with both groups. I support rent control. They don't. We don't always agree. But in terms of needing more housing, they are strong supporters of that. And having that voice, when we talk to more moderate Democrats or even Republicans, and they hear that the Apartment Association and the Realtors are supporting it, they might have been skeptical at first, but then they come on board. And I think we have to, what I mentioned before about environmentalism, there are plenty of people in the environmental movement who get it about conservation voters and the Natural Resources Defense Council on board with SB 35, even though it is a CEQA exemption. We're taking projects out of CEQA entirely. And we worked with them on some more substantive environmental protections, and they've endorsed the bill. And so we shouldn't write anyone off and assume that different groups aren't going to support. And we even got labor on board. It was a lot of negotiations, and we had to make some compromises on the bill. But we were able to build, I think, a pretty diverse coalition, and I think we need to build on that for future efforts.
So I'm wondering also, there's people here from everywhere. What do you think is next for the YIMBY movement? You've been here kind of since the beginning. What do you think is the next challenge for us or opportunity? Where do you see us going?
I want to see just more and more of the, whatever you call it, chapter or whatever the term would be, grow around California and in other cities. It's become more and more developed in the Bay Area, but I love that there's more happening in LA, and we need it in Orange County, and we need it like everywhere, San Diego, and then other cities around the country, and just keep growing the numbers, because that's what really matters, and getting involved in electoral politics. And there are a lot of people who don't like getting involved in electoral politics, but ultimately, when if you can choose candidates for city council or for the state legislature, or for governor, or whatever the case may be, and get behind these people, particularly in local office, where it doesn't, a modest effort can have big dividends in local office, and you can get people elected. We've seen some city councils in Silicon Valley and the South Bay and the Peninsula, like Palo Alto and Mountain View, that had councils that were very hostile to housing, that are now pro-housing majorities. And so you can flip city councils. And so I think being involved in electoral politics matters.
Well, I will second that. So this has been really wonderful, and I'm wondering, last words that you have. We have talked about kind of everything in this movement. I mean, I see us as touching on environmentalism, on social justice, on renters' rights. There's so many things that pull together the people in this room together, and I'm wondering, any last words you have so that I want everyone to go out and fight.
what I will say is this has to be a long-term movement. I was just talking to some of the folks from LA before about the fact that when we look at trying to get communities today to meet their housing goals, which the state establishes for them, and there's something called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which I'm sure you're all familiar with if you're in California arena. It's great, we're trying to get people to comply, but there's a backlog. There's a deficit from years and decades of underbuilding. And as a elected official, the reason, and it's starting to change now, but the reason why historically a lot of elected officials have avoided housing as a signature issue is because, unlike some other issues, it takes a long time to solve it. Everyone who made the Affordable Care Act happen, as big as that was, within a few years, there were already tangible benefits as millions of people went on to health insurance. So even something that massive, within your tenure in office, you can deliver results. You can, for even transit infrastructure, you can deliver results. Housing, even if we do everything we're gonna do, it's gonna take a long time to dig ourselves out of this hole. And as an elected official, that's hard. To say I'm gonna do all this work and get beaten up and spend political capital for work that may not bear any visible fruits until after I'm out of office. And that's why you have a lot of elected officials that sort of shy away from it, because there's a lot of downside and not as much upside. And that's why this has to be a long-term fight. Because if we just, do this, if the YIMBY movement does all this energy and great work for, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and then sort of peters out a little bit as people move on to other things, and you haven't done succession planning and kept recruiting the next generation, it's gonna, I don't want to say it's all for naught. It's not for naught. You've already made a big difference, but it's not going to meet its potential. If we can make this a movement, like other great movements in this country, we have an environmental movement, we have had a civil rights movement, we have had a movement to support children, a movement to support the humane treatment of animals, movements that have sustained themselves for decades. If we can create a pro-housing movement that sustains itself for decades, we will absolutely make profound change in California and in places across the country. So that's what it's about, long-term sustainability, building a long-term pro-housing movement.
Thank you. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. I'm going to try and find people, so yes.
Thanks. So, to ask you is, how much do you think people like the ones outside protesting are mistaken, and how much do you think they're opposed? Like, can you analyze and describe for us what you think about the opposing forces and what motivates them, the degree to which some can be reached and some can't, and how to reach that, how to interact with that?
Well, so so the opponents, they are correct in identifying the problem in terms of escalating housing costs and evictions and displacement. I completely agree with them in identifying that problem. And we all want the same end result, to let people stay in their housing, let people thrive. Where I disagree with them, and I think they are mistaken, is that shutting down development will somehow help achieve that goal, when we know that it will just make that goal even harder to achieve. I think that, and the people outside, I don't know them. I know a lot of the San Francisco protesters. I don't know the Oakland folks as well. I think that there is a real mix. I think that there are people that can be reached and who you can have that conversation with. There are some people who the ideology of development is the enemy is so deep that you will never reach them. And the unfortunate thing is, and it's less about the protesters and more about people who, the broader population, who might be tempted to listen to that message of new development is what's causing the problem. And those are the people we have to get, not necessarily the people on the bullhorn, but the people who are following them on social media and seeing the protests, and just getting that messaging out. The unfortunate thing is there are some very, very, I think, malicious people, and I will not name any names, but some of the San Franciscans know who I'm talking about, who put out, they're sort of the enablers, whereas they put out theories that are just false, like the theory that supply and demand just simply doesn't apply to housing. The theory that building more housing makes housing more expensive. And they'll say that. They're a little, we've been, I think, shaming them enough that they say it less, but they have some, just quacks who will put out papers writing that building more housing will make housing more expensive. And again, not that I don't want to buy into like a simplistic view of supply and demand. Housing, is a unique thing. It's not just like going to the dry cleaner. But the idea that building more housing makes housing more expensive, and if we just shut down, reduce the amount of housing that we create, then housing will be more affordable. It's a ridiculous argument. But there are people who make that argument, make it in a very sophisticated way, and it sounds really sophisticated, and then it manipulates people. And for people who they see the new development and they don't like it for a variety of reasons. Some people it's because, oh my God, it makes my neighborhood look different, or it brings more traffic in, or it blocks my view, or there's less sunlight reaching the street, and so they don't like it. Other people who say that I hate that new development because wealthier people are living there and I don't want them in my neighborhood. It changes the fabric of who's in my neighborhood. So people have sort of reactions to development, which are all, they're entitled to their view. But then what happens is you have these quacks who come in and give them the sheen of this like academic, in addition to the fact that you don't like it, it's going to make housing more expensive, so it's counterproductive. And they sort of manipulate people into sort of confirming what their internal bias is. And that's what is a real, to me, that has to be countered in a very, very forceful way.
Okay.
Hi, Senator. I'm Alex down in Silicon Valley. Can you help us get into the heads of more so elected officials, but potentially developers, if you're more comfortable with that audience? What are elected officials and developers thinking about our kind of ideas? What are the messages that resonate with them? And in negotiations on your bill or other conversations you're having with them, what are the lessons you're learning from those that you could impart on us?
Well, I think that for developers, there's a variety, a lot of different kinds of developers, and there are developers who are very sort of good government policy oriented. There are some developers that are less so. And so we have a mix of experiences. And so, and there's there are developers who their whole business model is sort of single family home, building further and further and further out. But there are developers who are very committed to building dense infill housing, and really, they understand the policy and they're committed to that. I mean, understanding that, private sector developers, they need to make money and they have to answer to their investors, so no one has a halo around their head, but it's a mix. And there are, when we work on legislation, we talk to a lot of different people from across the spectrum, but there are some developers who they just, they may not agree, like on SB 35, I have developers who don't agree with every aspect of the bill, but they have really valuable input, and they can tell you, hey, this is not, the way you're structuring this isn't going to work for X, Y, or Z reasons, or this will work. And so having that expertise helps, as long as you view it in the context of other voices as well. And so I think the development community, again, at least certain voices within the development community can be a very valuable resource, and in terms of helping us achieve our goals. In terms of elected officials, it's such a mix, because there are elected officials who are passionate about housing. there are elected officials who are just, their politics in my view aren't good. They tend to be much more sensitive to the more oppositional voices. And then there are a lot of elected officials who are either, housing is just not a focus for them, maybe because their community is just less impacted, or it's just not what their passion is. Their passion is education or some other very important issues. It's not a criticism of them. And that significant swath of elected officials are, I think, really important, because if you can just persuade them, say, listen, we're not asking you to make this your life's work. You can continue to work for children's health or for, whatever issue, really gets you up in the morning, but at least vote the right way. And those are in my view, the elected officials we need to focus on, just making sure people are educated, even if it's not an issue that is the focus of why they ran for office.
What do we do about cities like Berkeley that seem to take all of their intellectual prowess and political savvy and pour it into getting out of state law as fast as y'all can create it?
Council.
Yeah, no, I think fundamentally, the state, there's a lot we can do, and we are doing things like, in addition to SB 35, Senator Nancy Skinner, and Assemblymember Raul Bocanegra from Southern California have bills to strengthen the Housing Accountability Act. We have some other good bills as well, trying to close some of the loopholes. But it is challenging for the state to sometimes enforce on the local community. That becomes a political thing in and of itself. So in addition to having strong state laws, we have to have the local political pressure, electing good people to office, making sure that there is visibility, transparency, accountability of these local decisions. When the Berkeley City Council was proposing to downzone the city, there was, they backed down on that, at least for now. I think there are always other ways, but I mean, there was a public outcry, and I sent in a letter, Senator Skinner sent in a letter, there were a lot of people who showed up, and it had at least some impact. I'm not saying the fight's over. When Brisbane decided that for the Baylands project, and for those not in the area, Brisbane is a small, really beautiful town directly south of San Francisco, and they have this big swath of land right between their developed area and San Francisco called the Baylands, that a developer wants to put, I think, about 4,500 units of housing on it. And they announced that they prefer to have pure commercial and office and no housing there. But there was a real outcry, a major regional outcry about that. And they were getting criticized not just by San Francisco, because we would be have to absorb all that housing, but by voices in San Mateo County who were saying absolutely not. And so now they've gone back to the drawing boards, and there will be housing there, I'm confident. We can make sure that it's a larger amount. So I think that kind of public pressure and transparency really is important. And the YIMBYs have played a key role in all of these fights, just sort of flushing all of that to the surface and making sure that communities aren't able to do this under the radar, which is how they've done it for years.
Hey, Scott. First of all, I'm going to say I love the fact that you're making sure that communities build housing that's zoning compliant. That's great. But what are we doing to address exclusionary zoning that's inherently racist, that favors high-income communities? Because a lot of these local organizations, be it META or whatever, they're noticing that development is disproportionately put in their neighborhoods. And they don't, there's a reason there's no development being put in like Ingleside or the Berkeley Hills. What are we doing at the state level to make sure that we can't continue this modern form of redlining, which unfairly targets low-income communities?
Hey, everybody clap.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I always view it as, in terms of what hinders housing, the three major issues, so the three legs of the stool. One is the process, that even if they, because there is so much zoned housing capacity that simply doesn't get built because of the process, and that's what SB 35 and the Housing Accountability Act are trying to address. The second is the issue of fees. And I'm not an opponent of fees in development. I've supported inclusionary housing and other exactions. But at some point it gets to a level, and it could be unintentional or it could be intentional, where it makes housing infeasible. And so I think that's something that a lot of us are taking a look at, making sure that we have, a rational approach to fees. And then the third and the most fundamental is zoning. And it's the hardest, right? It's the hardest because that has always been just, exclusive, local control, and people can zone however they want, and especially communities that are zoned for single-family homes. We know even in San Francisco, the neighborhoods that are zoned we have neighborhoods in San Francisco that are zoned not just for single-family homes, we have a lot of that, but for detached single-family homes in San Francisco, in our tiny little 7x7 densely populated city. And the people who live in those communities will fight unbelievably hard to protect that zoning. And again, not criticizing, they will say, this is why I moved to this neighborhood, and how dare you try to change the character of my neighborhood. But we do have to address the zoning issue. And particularly, I took a lot of heat for being public about how there are so many BART stations and Caltrain stations surrounded by single-family homes, and that should never happen. That should be done. And so that is something that is definitely on the radar. I don't pretend to have, the solution that we're going to be able to get through, but if the voters choose to keep me, I'll be in the state senate for 12 years, and I have other allies, and I know that's an issue that's on our radar about how do we start over time impacting exclusionary zoning, because you are 100% right. It is exclusionary. It has huge impacts on low-income communities and communities of color.
Let's get some ladies. I know I'm a lady, but all right, I'm gonna pick a mayor or somebody else. No, you're a man too.
You gave me a moment. I took it. My name's Madeline. Hi. I was wondering, have historic districts come up all the way to the California legislature at all this year? I'm from Oregon, and that was our big fight this year. We lost part of it. We lost the historic part of it.
Well, so we have, we've taken historic resources to a new level in California through CEQA. And historic resources are protected by CEQA, and they've been defined very, very, very broadly as if it's 50 years old or more, then it is a potential historic resource and has to be sort of analyzed. And there are some 50-year-old ham-handed approach to say, fine, historic structures, I'm a supporter of protecting historic structures, but let's not just assume it just because something is of a certain age that it should have the same level of protection. When we have, so that there's that, and that's a CEQA issue. SB 35 takes a whole bunch of buildings out of CEQA, although we do have strict demolition controls in SB 35 that you can't tear down rent-controlled housing in particular. So in terms of the historic districts, I know San Francisco best. We have historic districts. There hasn't been an explosion of historic districts. We have some in our planning department that try to talk about potential historic districts, and so you have a potential historic resource in a potential historic district, and so it makes things a lot more challenging. So that's something that we're trying to grapple with, but it's really hard because people get, it's a hard issue politically, but we've had some real horror stories about our historic preservation people in the planning department taking just absurd positions about what is protected as historic when it's just not, and we just need to have a more thoughtful approach. Because it gives historic preservation a bad name when you start saying that this is, we had, I could give examples of just really outrageous situations.
And I also don't hate old buildings being used as a new tool by neighborhoods. If they don't get the down zoning, then they go to the national park.
Please do. How much do you think that already will help with secret reform versus what other secret reforms might be helpful to enable more housing production?
Yeah, and for people who don't know, level of service is about when you do sort of traffic analysis around CEQA in terms of the traffic impacts of new development. I mean, historically, it's been about the number of vehicles going through a particular intersection as opposed to the number of people going through an intersection. And so, for example, when a bus goes through an intersection, there might be 75 people on the bus, but that'll be treated the same as one car going through, which might have only one person on it. So level of service, or eliminating level of service, was designed to really focus on the number of people moving through, not the number of vehicles. And it really, once it's fully implemented, and it's not yet, it's been slow, but once it's implemented, I think it'll be helpful in reducing the ability of people to use traffic studies to oppose new development. And so we just need to make sure that our approach to transportation analysis is supportive of new housing and not undermining new housing.
And so the question was, what do we need to do beyond that? Are there more steps that you would want to be seeing in secret reform beyond that? How would it help the measure?
I mean, off the top of my head, I don't have anything, but we're happy to have that conversation about what maybe that.
So I want everyone to give our amazing State Senator Scott Wiener a huge we're going to do it this way, right? Everybody gathering here. No?
Oh my God, Scott, can you do the photo?
Yeah.
Because you're tall enough. How does this work? Yeah. So this. Oh yeah. Is it wide enough? We're going to try a couple different things, but we'll let you get there. Or we get it together.
Yeah.
All right.
A selfie of a selfie?
Everybody, move to this. Everyone who's on this side, move to this side. Follow Victoria.
There.
So get in as tight as you can, like sitting so that we can see everybody's faces, and then a whole bunch in the back, scooping in, lean in.
All people, please move to the back. Please, for the love of all short people, move to the back.
Should we kneel on the ground?
And you can, if you want to scoot into the lines as well, get comfy. We got a free seat here, we got a free seat there.
We're gonna do one more photo with Scott in it, so we're not blocking people 6 rows back. Then right after this announcement about voting, and then lunch is just about ready.